Happy coding.
Hey there, and welcome to the next video in our series of Intro to Web Dev. I am Kevin here. Good to see you again. And today we are going to talk about laying out your page in CSS. So last week you learned about CSS, or cascading style sheets, and that is a language that lets you add styling to your HTML content. So you have probably played around with things like colors and fonts and things like bold and italicized. There's all kinds of styling properties that you can use in CSS. And those are great. Those will get you pretty far. But the thing we're going to talk about today is an extension of that, and it's a set of CSS properties and concepts that let you move stuff around the screen. Yeah, let's just dive in. So to think about what am I even talking about? Like, what is laying out your page? So you have probably seen many types of web pages that have many types of layouts, but essentially what it means is placing the elements in your page in usually a hierarchy of some kind, where you might have, for example, up on the screen right now, I have like a left nav on the left, and then I have some content sort of in the middle, and then I have maybe like a table of contents or something on the right. And inside of each of those elements, then I have like even more content. So, on the left nav, I've got a bunch of links in the content itself. I've got all kinds of content inside of that. And then on the right, the table of contents, maybe that is also links, but you can have all kinds of things. So at the top, I've got maybe a heading, a header that shows links to other pages, and maybe I'll show, I don't know, a different example. I don't know why this is always my go-to web page, but here I am on Wikipedia, and it's the same kind of idea where at the top I've maybe got like a search bar and like some top heading stuff. I've got my left nav, I've got some information on the right, and you can see that the layout is kind of important, and positioning the elements sort of to the left or to the right or above or below can help you achieve those different like layout effects. So that is what I mean when I say layout. And there are actually a bunch of ways to do it, which, to be honest with you, as I learned web development myself, this was one of the hardest things for me to wrap my brain around, because there are actually so many ways to do it that it feels like overwhelming to me, or it felt overwhelming to me. And it wasn't until I don't know, went back and understood the history of like, why do we have all of these different ways? That's when it clicked for me. So when I teach about layout, I actually teach it sort of as a history lesson, because I think that context it sort of helps you understand, like, okay, why is there like 5 different ways to do this? So that's what I'm going to do. So let's see. So I'm going to open up a glitch project. This is just the template, so I'm going to remix this. I'm just creating a new, basically empty project here. Hopefully you've seen this, and by now you're getting a little bit familiar with the idea of like creating a project, but that's what I'm doing here. I've just got my template sort of remixed here into its own project that I can sort of use to work. So in here by default, I've got some HTML, I've got a couple of tags, and I have my CSS styles.css file loaded up here. Right now it's just empty, but that gives me a place that I can put my code. So here I am in the editor, and I'm going to take us back in time. That's time traveling music. Sound effects. I'm going to take us back to the year 1993. That is when the first version of HTML was introduced, and that was basically what you played with in the first week of our series here of class. And that was the like core HTML tags, no CSS back in 1993. CSS wasn't a thing yet. It was not invented. So you could have, H1 tags, you could have P tags, UL tags, all that good stuff. But let's say I wanted to, I don't know, I wanted to have a couple of links, UL, LI, like in a list. So maybe I'll actually make them links, href equals, and I want to just use fake sort of URLs for now. So I want to say like index.html, and I want to say that's home, and then I'm going to have like, I don't know, maybe about, and I don't know, pictures, something. So you can imagine that I'm like making a website that has like a home page, maybe an about page, and a site for pictures. And this doesn't matter because these are just fake, but I'll change the file names just in case. Like if I click on that, nothing, like it'll just take me to like a broken page because that file doesn't actually exist yet. But this is just example content. But I'm just using, plain old HTML like would have existed back in 1993. And let's say I wanted to make my webpage have sort of a left nav with some links and then some content on the right. You've likely seen that. How would I do that? How would I do that without CSS? And the answer, well, maybe before that, what I'll say is like, just talk about default styling. So the default styles, when you have like an HTML tag and then another HTML tag, is just to put them sort of in order, sort of vertically in the page. So I've got my UL here, which is just a list, and then I've got a P tag. And so it's like the UL comes first, then the P tag comes second, like in the page. And if you have more, it'll just add them, sort of vertically, and you can scroll down to see more. But that's how it would lay it out on the page by default. And if you think about, how the internet worked or how monitors, how small monitors were, like what technology looked like back in 1993, this made sense. You were generally going to be looking at the internet through like a pretty small monitor, and there wasn't really a strong need to like lay things out super carefully. But as time went on, monitors got a little bigger, and so people wanted to use more of that screen real estate. So as I make my window bigger here, like all this white space, it's just kind of wasted space. So people wanted to be able to lay out their HTML, their elements, like next to each other, left and right instead of top and down. So how would you do that before HTML? And I will admit that I didn't look the syntax for this up, so you're going to watch me struggle to remember how some of these tags work. But the rough answer to how people did this back in 1993 was they used tables. So table is an HTML tag, so I can look that up. Table HTML tag. And tables are a way to add, well, a table to your webpage. So you might have like a table of data that shows like, different numbers in it for whatever reason. And this was what people used to lay out their elements. So I'm going to use the table tag, tr, and td. Let's see if I actually remember that by the time I get back to the other tab. So I'm going to make my table. So I'm going to have a table element, and in here I'm going to have a table row. And then in here, I'm going to have 2 TDs. I think that's table data. Okay. And then, so I've got my table, which is right now just empty. And so I'm going to move my HTML into that table, inside that table. And I'm going to use my P tag, move my P tag into my data here. And there we go. So that does indeed show my UL on the left and then my content on the right. So to make this maybe a little more obvious, I'm going to steal a line from here, and that's CSS. So sure. Actually, I want to do this like as if it was 1993. So I'm pretty sure there's a border attribute in the table itself. So like border equals 1 or something. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is how I would have done it in 1993. You can see that my left nav, as it were, is on the left and my content is on the right. And you can imagine that I can expand on this. I can keep adding like different table cells, and maybe I add a heading, maybe that's a table row by itself. Maybe I add like a footer, maybe that's a table row. I can add like a right nav by adding another table cell here. But the idea is that I'm using the HTML table itself to lay out my content. And that's how it was back in the day. So there's examples of like old school web pages that kind of still use the table element to lay things out, but it's pretty unwieldy. It's pretty rigid, and the way you have to use it, it's just kind of annoying, and it's also really bad for things like screen readers. Like if you have a like an accessible device for various reasons, where you have something reading out the content of the page, tables basically break that functionality. So it's generally not how we do it anymore. But anyway, we're back in 1993, so this is how we did it. So now we're getting back in our time machine, and we're fast forwarding a few years. We're going to 1996. So here we are in 1996. Look around and think about what the world looks like, I guess. And this is when CSS 1 was introduced. This is the first version of CSS. And this is when you get things like font and colors and like the ability to bold and italicize without going through HTML tags. I believe you probably have borders and stuff at this point. I actually don't know that off the top of my head, but this is like the first version of CSS, and that's basically what you would have played with last week. That was like 1996 style CSS. So back in 1996, you were still likely using tables to do your layouts. So you're still likely doing something like this. So, all right, we're going to get back in our time machine, and we're going to fast forward just a couple more years, and now we are in 1998 or so. And I should maybe have an aside that in 1997, HTML itself introduced a new tag called the div tag, and that will come in handy in a second. But essentially in 1998, the second version of CSS, or CSS2, was released, and browsers started supporting it. And with CSS2, we got a new functionality called floats. And I will maybe go back to a previous version of my code to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to get rid of my table. I'm just going to sort of go back to what my code looked like before. And I'm trying really hard not to sneeze right now. But here we go. I've got my my UL and my p tag. I just took out the table, so I'm back to the old school style of just kind of the default styling on top and on bottom. And I'm going to use floats now to lay out my left nav and my content. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use that new div tag, or new as of 1997 or so. So I'm going to put each of my sections in a div. And you can think of a div as like basically just a rectangle is how I think of it. It's just like drawing a box, an invisible box around some content. It's a way to group things together and sort of split them up into like their own sections. By default, divs don't really do anything, but you can add CSS to them to make them more visible. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. But let me just get my HTML here. So now I've got my UL tag and my P tag both in their own div. And so far, nothing has really changed about the layout. And maybe what I'll do is I'll add a class to this one, and I'll say this is left. And I'll add a class to this one and say this is, I don't know, middle. So I'm just using like the standard CSS sort of class attribute here that we would have talked about last week. And I haven't styled it yet, so nothing has changed. But I now have a div and another div that I can style if I want to. So I'm going to jump over to my styles.css. And just to show what I mean by styling a div, I'm going to select my my left div, and I'm going to give it, I don't know, I'm going to give it a border of thick, solid green. And there you go. You see that like around my whole UL, I have given it a border. And I can do the same thing for, I forgot what I called that thing, dot middle. And maybe I'll say like border, thick, solid blue. And there you go. And I can add more styling. You know, I could change background colors. I could give different fonts and stuff to each div. But, you know, I'm just showing borders to show you that a div is a rectangle. So now that we have that, what I can do is, okay, remember we're back in 1997 or so, and we're 98-ish, and I am going to use this new feature called float. So I want my left nav to be on the left. So I can say float left. And that kind of messes things up because I'm not really done. I do have my my left green div over on the left. That is true. So that float keyword is telling my browser, hey, don't use the default layout where you're boring and you just go like, you know, top to bottom. Actually, I want this on the left. And so the browser says, okay, it's there on the left. But it's actually not smart enough to move anything else around. So what you had to do was set like margins and borders and stuff on the other divs. So I can do that. I can say, okay, now that I have my left nav on the left, I actually want to move my middle over to the right a little bit. So I can maybe add like, I don't know, like a margin left to it, and I'll give it like 100 pixels or so. Just kind of guessing. Yeah, okay, 100 pixels is about right. Maybe like 120. And okay, this works, right? This is a way to lay out my elements or my content on my page using CSS. I don't have a table anymore. If I go back to my index.html, there's no weird table stuff. I'm not like messing with my HTML to like place it in table cells anymore. I am using CSS to lay out my page. And this was an improvement. But it was still kind of unwieldy because, like, let's say, I don't know, for example, if I changed one of these to be like, I don't know, my great home page. If I changed the content of my left nav, I would have to go in and change my CSS. And that's annoying because, you know, your HTML changes all the time and you don't want to have to, you know, reconfigure your entire page every time you add some content. That's just, you know, it's just kind of a pain in the neck. So I'd have to go in and be like, okay, well now it's not 120 pixels. Now it's actually more like, I don't know, 150, actually 160 maybe. You know, I'd have to play with it quite a bit to get it to work. And that was all we had, though, back in 1997. I will say that there was another thing called blocks and inline blocks, but it was a similar idea where you could add some CSS to your page, and then you'd have to fiddle with it quite a bit to lay it out. And another thing I'll mention is like this technology is still around. So if you're like looking at a tutorial on the internet of like, how do I lay out my components in this way? Or how do I get, you know, a picture to be on the right edge of some text? Or how do I get the text to flow around an image? Like things like that, they will still use floats and blocks as well. And the idea is the same. It's fine. You're adding CSS properties to the elements to cause them to lay themselves out differently in the page. So it's not like this is ancient, you know, history that you'll never see again. You will absolutely still see floats and blocks like out in the wild. But this is the only thing we had back in 1997 or in 1998. So this was how we did it. And things were okay. But we're getting back in our time machine. And actually, we're going quite a bit further in the future. Now we're going from about 1998 to about 2017. So we're going forward almost 20 years. So for like 20 years, this is how things were done, using floats and break blocks as well. But for 20 years, this is how we did it. Every time we changed the content, we'd have to fiddle around with the CSS to like make sure that our layout was, was working. And it wasn't until 2017 that we got a new feature in CSS. This is when CSS 3 came out. So it took like 20 years for CSS 3 to come out. And this new feature is called Flexbox. And this is really like the core of the content that I sort of want you to focus on this week. So let's see. So to talk about that, what do I want to do? I want to get rid of some of my styles here. So I'm going to go back to my old school. So I don't have any flex, or I don't have any float in here anymore. I've gotten rid of that, and I've just got my default here. So to talk about Flexbox, remember like with floats, how annoying it was to reconfigure your CSS every time you change your HTML. If you added some more text, you'd have to make more room for that in your margins and stuff when you were laying out your elements. So Flexbox, as of 2017 or so, was a new feature that let you lay your elements out sort of horizontally next to each other without needing to do that anymore. So it kind of just magically works. So let me kind of show what that looks like. So let me go back to my index.html. And I'm going to change a couple of things here. So most importantly, when you're dealing with Flex or Flexbox, you need to think about things in terms of like a container and then the children inside of that container. And we've already seen that quite a bit, actually, where, I have my body element, and that body element is itself a container. It contains my left div. That div is itself a container. It contains this UL. That UL contains these LIs. Each LI contains an A. So this is the idea of like nesting HTML that we talked about like way back in the first week. And Flexbox uses this quite a bit. So just like remember that that's a thing. And to sort of show that, what I'll do is I could use my body like as my outermost sort of container, but usually I don't like to do that. So I'll add another div and I'll call it container or so. So I'll say class equals container. And I haven't actually added any styles to my container, but I just have it so I can add styles in a second. Okay, so I've got my container. Maybe I will add one style to it. I'll say dot container. By default, divs don't really have their own styling. They just sort of stack vertically. But I'll just to show it, I'll say like border thick solid red or so. And yep, there we go. You can see that, I think. So if I zoom way in, you see that my outermost div has this red border, and the red div contains the green div and the blue div. So the container div contains the left nav and the content, or the left class div and the middle class div. And then those divs contain, more content and whatnot. But so far, all I've done is add a border to make it a little more obvious, like what's going on. I will likely take those borders away in a second, but before I do that, what I want to do is add flex to this CSS. So right now, I just have like, no layout at all. It's just doing the default thing. I don't have a float. I don't have anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say display : so display is the name of the property that I want to use. And then the value for that property is going to be flex. And just by default, just with that one magic word, display flex, I have, a layout that has something on the left and something on the right. So that's all I had to do. I just said display flex, and I didn't have to add any styles to the left. I did not have to add any styles to the middle. It just sort of works by default. And the real magic here is this will work pretty much, reasonably, no matter what I throw at it. So remember back in Floatland, back in like 1997 or whatever that was, when I changed the content of my left nav, I had to go back into my CSS and change my CSS. But I no longer have to do that. So I'm sort of running out of space here, but let me, where are you? It's so annoying. Um, yeah, that works. Okay, sure. So let's change this. Let's add some more. Like let's get annoying with it. Really great homepage. And what happens? It just kind of works, right? It just automatically gave it more space. And I can do the same thing, over here. This is my website. This is just kind of placeholder content, so it's not, super compelling. But as I add more content, Flex sort of handles it for me. I no longer have to guess at like exactly how wide will that element be with that content and then kind of give it a different margin or anything. It just works. So that is the power of Flex, and it works by thinking about things in terms of containers and children. So far I've only shown you like one property, the actual display Flex property, but there are many Flex properties that let you sort of customize this behavior. So let me think about how I want to do this. Let me change my index back to something a little bit more reasonable. This is my website. I'm going to take away some of that extra content, and I'm going to get rid of this just so I have something a little more reasonable to play around with. So here I go. I've got my left nav and I've got my middle content inside of the container, which uses Flex to have this like default like left and right sort of layout here. But let's say I wanted to change how they are positioned. So right now there's the left nav, and then like right next to it is the middle content section. So I can add other Flexbox properties to specify that. So the property I'm looking for, I think, is justify content, if I remember. Justify content, and I'm going to give it a value of, I don't know, like space between. And there you go. So now, instead of smushing them right next to each other, now it says, or Flex tells the browser, lay them out with space in between them. And I am not really specifying like exactly how much space. I'm not saying give them 100 pixels, give them, 33%. I'm not giving it, specific numbers. I am just saying do your best. And it works pretty well. So that's kind of the power. Like I'm not fiddling with the numbers anymore. I am using Flex properties to let Flex do the work for me. So there are a bunch of properties that I can specify on the container itself, and I'll talk more about those, I think, in a second. But I can also specify properties on the children. So remember, I have a container that contains everything, and I have children inside of that. I have set a few or a couple properties on the container, which changes the behavior of Flex a little bit. I can also set those properties on the children. So children have different properties in Flex, and one of them is, let's see. So right now, what happens as I like as this as the page has more than enough room right now, what happens is each child, each div, sort of shrinks to only as big as it needs. Like it doesn't take up any extra room, even if I have a ton more room. So let me pop this open into its own tab. And here's what that looks like. And it looks, a little ridiculous as I get, a wider monitor. I just have a ton of white space. So I can actually customize that by telling my children, hey, actually, you should grow when the page gets a little bigger. So to do that, I'll say flex-grow, and I'll give it a value of 1. And now if I pop that open into its own tab, where'd that go? Here. Now what happens is, maybe I'll give it like a little background or something. Background, light blue. Sure. Just to be able to see it a little bit better. So now, as my page gets much bigger, my flex element there grows along with it. So I just zoomed in, and now instead of having the elements be like far apart and like having all that white space in the middle, now I am saying to my middle content element here, hey, you should grow when the page gives you more room. The other interesting thing with grow is that I can tell multiple elements to grow, and I'll sort of show you what that looks like. So let's say I told both my left and my right to grow. So I'm going to say, I'm going to actually give it a background of light green, and let's see what that looks like. Yep. And then I'm going to say flex grow 1. And now if I go back here and refresh, as my page like grows and shrinks, each element here, each child in the flex container takes up roughly the same amount of space because I've given them both flex grow of 1. Now, let's say I wanted both to grow, but I wanted one to be like a little bigger. I wanted it to use more space. I can change that. So this is like, again, this is the power of flex. I can specify more information when I want to, but I'm not really fiddling with like exact pixel values anymore. So let's say I wanted my middle to grow twice as much as my left. So I would say flex grow of 2 for my middle and flex grow of 1. So these are relative to each other. So, these can be whatever I want. I could say like this one grows at like 5 and this one grows at 3, and this would be like relative to each other. So usually I stick with like 2s and 1s and stuff, but now what will happen when I go back to where this was in its own tab, let me find that here. If I refresh, now if I start out really, really teeny tiny, they start out kind of the same size, but as my page gets bigger, my middle nav, my middle div, the blue div, is growing faster than my green div. So it ends up like roughly twice as big. But again, I'm not really worried about exact pixel values anymore because, we're living in the future now. Okay, so that is the idea of using Flexbox by setting, first of all, display flex. This is the most important thing because this kicks everything off. And then setting other properties on both the container and on the children to like specify the like behavior of the flex layout. So from here, the game is what properties are there? And this gets at a thing I've said a few times, like I don't expect you, in fact, I don't really want you to try to memorize a bunch of properties or HTML tags or really anything. Instead, the most important lesson that you can learn is how to look this stuff up. So there are a few places. One, which is maybe a little bit obvious, is here's the website that I am directing you to that I wrote. And this itself contains a bunch of flex properties here. So if I skip down there, I've got my display flex, I've got flex direction. What's that do? I've got flex wrap. Looks like this like helps the elements sort of wrap around each other, and that could be useful. I've got justify content, align items, all this stuff. I can play with each of these. And this is similar to how you might look it up on, W3 schools or whatever. Another really great resource, which is basically your best friend when you're dealing with flex, is, I'm going to skip down here to the bottom, this complete guide to Flexbox on CSS tricks. So this page is like a phenomenal reference with Flex. It has like all these like nice illustrations, and on the left here, this is properties that you can set on the parent, and then on the right, this is properties you can set on the children. And so you can kind of scroll down and just imagine like, you have a goal. I want my items to be laid out XYZ, like in this way. I want the thing to grow in this way, or I want them to be arranged in a certain way. Well, scroll through this page and look for a picture that looks like what you want. And that is a hint that that is the property that you want. So here's like different values for justify content. So you can think about like, how do I want my elements to lay out? Do I want them all sort of squished in the middle? Do I want them sort of spread out where like the first one is on the left edge, the last one's on the right edge? Do I want more space in between them? What do I want? You can choose. And do I want my children to all sort of be lined up, or do I want one kind of off center? You can scroll through here and look at all of these options and try them out and bring them into your project. And you can also, straight up use, your favorite search engine and whatnot. But there are many resources, but the idea is the same as what I just did over here, which is you are setting properties on the parent, and you're setting properties on the child. And these are like flex properties, which they're just CSS properties, but they're specifically geared towards changing the behavior of like the Flexbox layout. Okay, so there's a few things I want to cover, but I don't want to ramble for too much longer. So there is this idea of nesting layouts, which I'll talk about. And then the other thing I want to do is maybe just work through a like pretty traditional layout and how I would do that in Flex. So actually, I'm just going to do both of those at the same time. So what's the best way to do this? I'm going to delete everything. Actually, I'm going to delete everything from scratch, like no styles and no index and nothing. Well, I'll keep my container because I'll always want that. I will likely add all of that back in at some point, but I just want to start from scratch. And what I want to implement is something that is kind of referred to as the Holy Grail layout. And this is very popular. This is like on basically every single web page ever, where what you have is you have sort of a heading at the top. So like, this guy. Then you've got a left nav. You've got a like center sort of content section. You've got a right nav. And then you've got all the way at the bottom, you've got a footer. This is, very standard. This is on many a web page. So here's Wikipedia, has that same kind of layout where you've got, a heading at the top, you've got a left nav, a center, and sort of something on the right. And if I scroll down all the way to the bottom, I'm guessing, yep, I've got well, depending on how you define it, there's stuff here, there's multiple things down at the bottom here, but the idea is the same. You've got those different sections that each contain sort of their own content. And I'm going to do that. I'm going to sort of figure out how to do that from scratch using Flex. So I am going to think about it in terms of like breaking it down into like a hierarchy. So in my brain, what I'm doing is I'm kind of drawing rectangles like in my brain. And I might even, I don't know, take this into, Microsoft Paint or something and like actually draw rectangles around it. So, maybe I actually will do that. Sure. So let me take a screenshot of this and I'll show you sort of what I'm doing like in my brain. It's a scary place. But if I copy that screenshot into beautiful Microsoft Paint, yeah, that'll work. And then I give myself like a little marker. Okay. So what I'm doing when I start laying out in a web page is, first off, like I'm kind of picturing the web page. Here I took a screenshot of Wikipedia, but I can kind of picture it in my brain. Like, here's what I want. I want a heading. I want like a left nav, center, right nav. So first what I do is I break it down into like a hierarchy of divs. So I might have like something way at the very top, that's going to be my container div. That's going to contain everything. That's kind of a freebie. You always are going to have like an outermost div or something. And then I have like this header. So then I've got this, okay. And then inside of that, I've got other elements. So, maybe I have an image, maybe this is like, a link, this is like a text box, and I can maybe imagine that I might have this heading div. This might itself be a flex container that then contains each of these elements. So I'll worry about that when I get to it, if I get to it. And then I might have, let's think about this. I might have another div that might contain all of this. And then inside of that, I'll have, maybe this one is itself a separate div, right? And then maybe this is a separate div, and this is a separate div, this thing on the right. So I'm breaking it down into that hierarchy. And then, down at the bottom, I might have like a heading, but, I can't show that all on the screen. So maybe I'll just say, and there's something down here, but it'll likely be inside the container, but whatever, it's down there somewhere. But what I'm doing is mentally breaking the web page down into this hierarchy, and then I can worry about like each one by themselves. So that's what I'm doing. So let me go back to my code and like kind of put that into code. So I have my outermost container, right? And then I'm going to have something like, I don't know, a div class equals, top. And in here, maybe this is, I don't know, maybe I'll say like a href equals whatever home.html. This is just kind of fake, but I'm just kind of showing what it would look like. Home, and maybe I'll give it a couple. Maybe I'll have like home and some other stuff. I'll just give it 3. Home and about, and what I used before, pictures. And I'll change these just because I am annoying. So home, about, and pictures. So I've got my like top nav up there, and I haven't added any flex or anything. This is kind of the default, what it'll give me. So these A's are just kind of next to each other. It's fine. And then what I want is maybe my middle section, which is this. I should have used different colors, but it's like this this div here, which is going to itself contain 3 other divs. So let's think about that. So I'm going to have div class equals, and what should I call this? Maybe middle. I'm going to run out of words to use to specify these classes, but this is, maybe I'll call this like middle dash container, right? Because this is going to be itself a container. And then in here, I'm going to have 3 other divs. So div class equals left, div class equals, this is going to be like middle content just to disambiguate it. And then finally, div class equals right. And then in here, I want, more content. So just to fill something out, like this is my beautiful web page, spelled right. Maybe in my left nav, maybe this is where I'll have a UL. And, you can imagine this is, real content, but for now, I'll just say like home, about, and pictures. And again, I have not actually specified any flex, anything. So this is just like the default layout that it's going to give me. I'm just kind of filling in the content for now. And then I'll have like one more UL over on my right. And this could be like, I don't know, chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. Okay, so this is kind of fake, but what I've done so far is I've specified the content itself for my header, and then my left nav, my center nav, or my left nav, my center div, and my right div. So then one more, I'll do like a footer, and this is where it gets kind of confusing because now you're dealing with like this mess, and this is where the idea of like formatting your code can be really helpful because you can line stuff up. So I want this to be like inside the container, but like under my middle container. So if I look at like where this is lined up, then that's here. So if I say now here, div class equals footer, and like I'll say like, I don't know, thanks for coming to my webpage. That'll just be my footer. Okay, so I've got my content and I've broken it down sort of mentally into these different divs, which now means that I can lay those divs out. Um, so what am I going to do? I am going to say first my container div, I'm going to say that that itself is Flexbox. So I'm going to say dot container and I'm going to give it a style and I'm going to say display flex. And that did something. What it did is it made my outermost container, my outermost div, it gave it a layout of Flex. It enabled Flex. But remember that by default, Flex will put things like left to right, which is actually not what I want for my outermost div. So for my outermost div, the elements inside of that are actually top to bottom. So I could probably get away with just not using Flex on that one, but just to sort of show you another Flex property. If I go here and I look for a property that switches the order of or the direction that my children go. And spoiler alert, it's this one, it's flex direction. I sort of knew that ahead of time, but if I didn't, I could look through this page and say, oh, by default, it's left to right, but I actually want it to be going top down. How do I do that? And I think the way I do it is I say flex direction column. So I'll do that. Flex direction column. And okay, so this basically just put it back to how it was before, but I am now like using Flex. So if I wanted to add like spacing or whatever, I could. So that's progress. Next, what I want to do, I want to then move on to my next child and maybe, what is that? That's my heading, I think. So it's actually, okay, I called it top. So if I go here and I say dot top, and I say display flex, cool. And okay, so what that did, if you saw that, is it smushed these together, which is maybe not what I want. So what I want to do is find a Flexbox property that puts some space between them. And I think we already saw that earlier, but let's find that. That was justify content. And I don't know, I could play around with this, but let's say space between for now. So I want justify content and space between. And okay, sure, good enough. I tend to want to fiddle around with this stuff, but this is just an example, so you can fiddle around with whatever makes sense for your web page. But the idea is the same. I am adding properties to change the behavior of the layout. So I've got my heading, at least started. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to say, okay, that was my top div here. So now I'm going to go for middle container. And I think this is where things are going to get a little interesting. So I'm going to say middle container. And I'm going to say display flex. It's sort of always how I'm going to start. And ooh, that did something. And I've got my left nav, I've got my content, I've got my right nav. That's actually pretty good just by default. I could maybe add some, borders or something, but just kind of sticking with flex stuff. What I might do now that I'm looking at this is play around with that flex grow property, because if I keep losing my page, here it is. I should have given it a better title. If I refresh now, what is happening as I make my web page, bigger or smaller is, let me zoom out a little bit. Okay. As I make it bigger, smaller, like my heading, at the top, that thing's getting bigger, but, my content itself is not getting bigger. So maybe I want to add a Flexbox property that does that. So that's another one that we saw. That was the flex grow property. But if it wasn't, I could, go to a search engine and type in like, I don't know, CSS, Flexbox, set, content size, something like that. And this would take me to a few resources. So yeah, look, the first result is the page that I'm already on. That's like such a popular reference for it, but how to make them the same size, here's other tutorials on Flexbox. So, you can get more information if you don't know it ahead of time. But, I happen to know it ahead of time. So I'm going to go to what? I'm going to look at my middle content here, and I'm going to give that a flex property of flex grow 1. And now if I go back to my window, where'd that go? Here, and refresh. Now my middle content is growing. It's hard to see because my middle content doesn't really contain a bunch of stuff, but I could maybe add like a background or something. But what it's doing is it's pushing my right div over to the right. And maybe that looks a little more reasonable. This would all look a little more reasonable if I had like actual content, but that would take way too long. But the idea is that now it's growing and I'm adding more and more properties to like flesh this out more and more. And I might even actually be done because my actual footer doesn't really contain anything other than that one single sentence. So maybe just to show what this looks like, I'll add a bunch more content here. So this is my web page a bunch of times. Bear with me. Sure, good enough. So you might think of that as, like it has like an actual, content in there, but now that's what this looks like. I've got my center section, which is growing to fill up as much space as it will take. And then I've got my left nav on the left, and I've got my right nav on the right. And from here, I could do a bunch more stuff. I could add padding and borders and margins and stuff. And that's not really Flexbox, but it works with Flexbox. So I don't know, let's say my middle container, I wanted to add more padding to it. So I could say padding 50 pixels and bring that web page back up. And now I'll have, maybe just a little more. Oh, I didn't want middle container. I wanted, so maybe I should pause and say like, I just made a mistake, which is a normal part of coding. So rather than just like really quickly fix it, I'm going to actually sort of spend some time to show like what I did and how I will figure it out. So what I wanted to do, what I expected to happen is when I gave my middle content some padding, I expected it to have, more white space around it basically, but instead the white space was around the whole thing. And like, that's not what I expected. So what the heck? That was my first sort of reaction when I saw this page. And that means usually that I did something wrong. So my move was to go to my code and just sort of read through it like pretty carefully, like line by line. And I've gotten, I've done this a bunch of time. I've made a bunch of mistakes. So some of this is like automatic for me, but what I am doing is reading through and like carefully thinking about like, is that what I meant to do? So I'm looking at like, where is that padding? That padding is here. Okay. What element did I put that in? Okay. I put it in my middle container. Is that what I meant to do? And if I think about it, no, that's not what I meant to do. I meant to put it on the content. So I don't want it on the container. I want it on the content because if I think about, this thing, I want it on this, this middle section here, this content section. I don't want it on this outermost container section. At least that's not what I want. Kind of depends on what you want out of your layout. But if I think about this, I don't want there to be a bunch of white space around like the whole thing, but like then there not being any white space here. Like that's not what I want. So what that means is to debug this, I'm going to move this from my container down to my content. I'm going to go back to that page and I'm going to refresh. And yeah, okay, I was zoomed in. That's where it went. So now I have like that padding sort of around my content where I've got my left, I've got my right, and I've got my center here, and it's like got white space on all of the sides. Now, part of me really wants to get in and be like, is that actually exactly how much padding I want? Probably not. Like I probably didn't want padding on the top. So, how do I change padding only on the left and right? Well, I can do that by using the resources that we've seen so far. But for this video, it doesn't matter. This is just an example. But if I look at this, this is like a bare bones version of that like holy grail layout where I've got my heading at the top. I've got a left nav over here. I've got some content. I've got a right nav over here, and then I've got a footer. So I could add other content to it. But the idea is to sort of summarize. I am using Flexbox, which means that I set Flex properties on both the container and the children inside that container. And based on those properties, Flexbox does a reasonable job of handling the layout for me. So I'm no longer really worrying about like exact pixel values. I am for stuff like, padding and margins and stuff, but that's more aesthetic than anything. Like the core behavior of the layout works pretty well, no matter what size screen I throw at it. And it sort of adjusts accordingly. And if I went to this on a phone, it would work. If I went to this on like a huge widescreen monitor, it would work. And I'm not too worried about it anymore. So the other things I want to mention are, so this was mostly about Flex and sort of the time machine history that we took to get here. So through like tables to floats, now to Flex. There are even more layouts out there. So I sort of alluded to one called like inline blocks. That's another one that's sort of older. There's a newer one called grid. So if you look up like CSS grid, it's actually pretty similar to Flexbox in the way that it works. And it's actually a little newer than Flexbox. And a little more complicated, I think. But if you want to layer elements out like in a grid or have like sort of 2 dimensions to the way you are thinking about things, then grid is another great thing to look at. I'm not going to really cover it because this video is already way too long, but that's another way that you can lay your elements out. And the last thing I'll say is, so what I would encourage you to do, like as a challenge, is, okay, you just saw me do the Holy Grail layout in Flexbox, and it's fine, it works okay. And I think to really understand like the value that Flex is bringing you, try to do this without Flexbox. So go back in time, go back to 1993, and do this with a table, and then try to remove your resize your window. And see, like, does it work in every size, or are some sizes a little janky? And then try to do it with float. And, you can do it with float. People did it for 20 years, but it's just a little more painful. But forcing yourself to do it with float will make you appreciate like what Flex is giving you here. So that's a little optional challenge, but I think if you're like, I still don't get like what's the point of Flex? Yeah, go do that and you'll see. All right, I am going to shut up now. That was too much of me talking, but hopefully this at least gives you the concepts behind Flex. And again, I'm not expecting you to come out of this being like, oh, I know everything about Flex. I know every property. I know exactly how to do anything that I could possibly think of, because that's not how it works. But now you know that Flexbox is a thing. You know that it works by setting properties on the parent and on the children, and like looking new stuff up and pulling it into your project and trying things out. And as long as you know that, then you can do pretty much anything. All right, well, thanks for watching. And in the next one, we'll do like a project or something around Flex. But for now, I will say thanks. And as always, happy coding.